So, we're always hearing about the state of the family these days, right? Well, get ready, because on this deep dive, we're tackling a pretty intriguing angle. We're diving into the work of sociologist Bradford Wilcox.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he's found some fascinating connections between faith, family stability, and, believe it or not, domestic violence rates.
Now, that's something you don't hear every day.
Mm,
And I'm guessing it's not just any faith that Wilcox is interested in.
You're right on the money. His research really zeroes in on evangelical Protestant men, specifically the impact of regular church attendance.
That's sure to raise some eyebrows. There are a lot of stereotypes out there about conservative religious groups, and let's be honest, they don't exactly scream happy families all the time.
It's true, those stereotypes definitely exist. But Wilcox's research actually challenges those assumptions head on.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, his work focuses on evangelical Protestants because their faith puts such a strong emphasis on family and marriage. It's woven into the very fabric of their beliefs.
So it's less about just showing up for Sunday service and more about how those beliefs actually play out in their daily lives.
Exactly. It's about how faith translates into action. Wilcox talks about how evangelical churches present this very distinct vision of marriage,
Hmm.
often rooted in biblical principles like commitment, sacrifice, and mutual respect.
It's like a whole different framework for approaching relationships.
Right. And a key part of that framework is the husband's role as a spiritual leader within the family structure.
Okay, so we've got these men who are deeply involved in their faith communities where these values are constantly being reinforced. But how does that translate into measurable differences within their families? What's the concrete impact?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Well, Wilcox doesn't shy away from it. He tackles it head-on in his research. In one study, he found that men who attend church weekly are roughly 30% less likely to engage in domestic violence compared to those who rarely or never attend.
30%, that's huge. What explains such a dramatic difference? Is it really just about church attendance?
It's a great question, and Wilcox argues it's about more than just checking a box on Sunday morning. It's about the community, the support system that a church provides.
It's about having that network, that sense of belonging, right?
Exactly, and also a level of accountability that reinforces those values.
That makes sense. It's one thing to believe in treating your spouse with respect in theory, but having a whole community that supports and expects that behavior adds a whole other layer.
It's like a built-in support system for your marriage, and these communities often go beyond just sermons. They offer things like marriage counseling, parenting classes, support groups, all those resources that can help couples navigate challenges before they spiral out of control.
It's like a preventative measure, equipping couples with the tools and support to build strong and healthy relationships.
It reminds me of those statistics about the current state of family structure in America, the ones Wilcox cites in his book, Get Married.
Oh, right. I think I know what you're referring to. Isn't that where he pulls that data from the National Center for Family and Marriage Research?
That's the one. And the numbers paint a pretty stark picture. Divorce rates hovering between 40–50%, a significant portion of births to unmarried parents. It's a trend with real consequences.
Absolutely. And while correlation doesn't equal causation, we can't ignore the impact this has on children.
It's hard to deny that connection. There's decades of research showing that kids who grow up in stable two-parent homes tend to fare better academically, emotionally, even economically.
And it's not just about money. It's about giving kids the best possible foundation for life.
Which brings us back to Wilcox's argument, right? That stronger families lead to a stronger society. It has this ripple effect outward.
It's bigger than just what happens within the four walls of a home. It impacts communities, the economy, everything.
It really is foundational. So if faith can influence family stability the way Wilcox suggests, it becomes more than just personal belief. It's something with the potential to create real societal change.
It's a powerful idea. And Wilcox doesn't stop there. He goes even deeper, looking at the specific mechanisms at play, how Christian teachings translate into real-life relationship skills.
So we're going from this big picture society level down to a more individual level now. Like, how do these Christian teachings Wilcox talks about actually play out in a marriage day to day?
Well, he points to some pretty central principles within Christianity. Forgiveness, humility, grace. They might sound kind of abstract, I guess.
Yeah, like lofty ideals.
Right. But Wilcox says they have a real impact on how couples deal with conflict.
So less about that eye for an eye and more about turning the other cheek, building up that resilience.
That's the idea. Think about it. Approaching those inevitable rough patches in a marriage with that mindset of forgiveness instead of holding on to resentment, that's huge.
Yeah, I can see that. Holding grudges is a surefire way to make a home miserable.
For sure. And then there's humility, which, let's be honest, that's a tough one for any of us. It's about letting go of always needing to be right, really listening to your partner's point of view.
Not always easy.
Not at all. But Wilcox says faith can be this powerful motivator to push aside ego and be more open in disagreements.
Okay, I get the theory, but could you give us like a real-life example of how this forgiveness or humility would actually look in a family?
Sure. Imagine a couple. They're arguing about money, right?
Yeah.
Happens all the time. A husband who's coming from this place of humility might be more willing to own up to his part in the problem. Maybe admit he overspent without really thinking about his wife's concerns.
Which is not easy to do. Admit you messed up.
Exactly. But that's what opens the door to a more productive conversation.
It's about taking responsibility instead of placing blame. So then, where does grace fit into all of this? Feels connected to forgiveness, but with something more. Well, graceful about it, I guess.
You got it. Grace is that understanding that, look, we're all human, right? We all screw up sometimes. It allows for those imperfections for growth, gives you room to repair things. It's the opposite of holding someone's past mistakes over their head.
It's about giving them a chance to make things right, to move forward.
That's it. And this all ties into something else Wilcox talks about: servant leadership.
Okay, now that's an interesting one. Seems kind of counterintuitive, especially these days. We usually think of leadership as power, being in charge.
I know, right?
Okay.
But Wilcox says that's not the case within Christianity, particularly how it's taught within evangelicalism. Servant leadership flips the script. It's about putting the needs of your spouse, of your family, above your own. Leading through love, serving, supporting, not through control or some kind of power dynamic.
So less about my way or the highway and more about being a partner who supports and encourages the other person. Do you have an example of what that would look like in a marriage?
Definitely. Picture this. Husband, wife, she's got this really demanding career. A husband who's embracing this idea of servant leadership might step up at home, take on more responsibilities, and he's not doing it out of obligation, but out of love. He wants to see his wife succeed.
It's recognizing that her success is their success.
Exactly. A true partnership.
Hmm.
But Wilcox doesn't stop at what's going on just within religious communities. He also looks at the bigger cultural picture.
Yeah, it's like he's contrasting the values emphasized within these communities with what's happening in the culture at large, right?
Right. And he sees some pretty big contradictions there.
So we've talked about this support system that these faith communities provide, right? And all the specific teachings that Wilcox connects to stronger relationships. But you're saying he sees this disconnect between those values and what's being promoted by the culture at large.
Yeah, he does. In his book, Get Married, Wilcox kind of goes on the offensive a little. He says that contemporary American culture often it promotes values that are like the opposite of lasting commitment, family well-being, things like that.
Yeah, you've got that constant message of individualism, instant gratification, hookup culture. It's all about me, me, me.
That's it. And Wilcox's point is that while that focus on individual fulfillment can feel empowering in the moment, it doesn't necessarily translate to building the kind of relationships that, really stand the test of time.
Which goes right back to his whole argument about the benefits of a more family-centric approach for society as a whole, which you don't hear too often these days.
It's definitely countercultural. And I think that's what makes Wilcox's work so interesting. Like, it makes you rethink those assumptions about marriage, family, and the values that actually contribute to a thriving society.
Right. So for our listener, the person who's been with us on this deep dive so far, what would you say is the main thing they should take away from Wilcox's research?
I think the biggest takeaway is that faith might be more than just like a personal belief. Wilcox's work suggests it can have a much wider impact, affecting not just individuals, but families, communities, the whole nine yards.
It's like we were saying before, the power of a community that actually reinforces positive values. It's not just about believing in something, it's about actually living it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And while his research is focused on evangelical Protestants, a lot of those principles, he's talking about commitment, sacrifice, forgiveness, servant leadership. Those are values that go way beyond any one religion.
Right. It seems like he's hinting at a bigger societal impact here. It's that idea that strong families are the backbone of a strong society, and that those families really thrive when those values are front and center.
Yeah. It's a perspective that kind of challenges all of us to think bigger than ourselves, to think about, the well-being of our communities, of future generations. It's like we're all connected.
That's a great point. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, haven't we? The research, the cultural context, those big implications of Wilcox's findings. But to wrap things up here, I'd love to leave our listener with a question to think about.
Love it. What's the question?
What if, and just think about this, what if more people embrace those values that Wilcox talks about, that commitment, sacrifice, putting family first? How would that change things? How would our community be different if we shifted our focus from me to we?
Now, that is a question worth pondering.
And on that note, we'll leave our listeners to do just that. This has been quite a deep dive into faith, family, and society. Until next time, keep exploring those connections.